How does a convicted killer, caught red-handed with the remains of an unthinkable crime, completely paralyze the highest court in the British Empire? Because she pulled an ancient, forgotten medieval loophole out of the history books to stop her own execution. But the real question isn't just how she lied to the judges. It is how a panicked justice system, facing massive public pressure, almost sent completely innocent men to the gallows just to close the case. By the end of this story, you will see exactly how the law is forced to protect even the most monstrous criminals. Not out of mercy, but to stop the system itself from becoming a weapon. If you want to understand how the justice system behaves when it is pushed to its absolute limit, hit subscribe now, because this mystery only gets darker from here. To truly understand the dark events that unfolded in the spring of 1879, we have to look closely at the setting. Richmond, Surrey was not the bustling, integrated part of London we know today. In the late 19th century, it was a picturesque, affluent, suburban retreat situated right along the River Thames. It was a place where wealthy Londoners escaped the smog and congestion of the industrial city. The tree-lined streets were quiet, filled with manicured gardens, large villas, and rows of pristine, semi-detached properties. Society here was governed by strict, unyielding Victorian rules of etiquette, class structure, and domestic order. For a respectable household in Richmond, maintaining a clean home and a proper appearance was not just a matter of preference. It was a social necessity. At number 2 Mayfield Cottages, a charming, 2-story brick home also known locally as Vine Cottages, lived a woman named Julia Martha Thomas. She was a 55-year-old widow who had survived 2 husbands. Mrs. Thomas was a woman of independent means, comfortably well off, and deeply concerned with her standing in the community. She dressed in fine silk gowns, wore expensive jewelry, and regularly attended the local church. To her neighbors, she appeared to be the very model of Victorian propriety. But behind closed doors, Mrs. Thomas lived a deeply lonely and increasingly anxious life. She was known to be highly eccentric, obsessively neat, and notoriously difficult to please. She possessed a fiery, unpredictable temper and a sharp tongue, particularly when it came to managing her household. Because of her demanding nature and constant micromanagement, she cycled through domestic servants at an alarming rate. No one could seem to meet her impossibly high standards for more than a few weeks at a time. In January of 1879, Mrs. Thomas found herself entirely alone once again, desperately searching for a live-in general servant to manage the heavy cooking, cleaning, and laundry. That was when 30-year-old Kate Webster walked through her door. Born as Catherine Lawler in County Wexford, Ireland, around 1849, Webster was a woman who had spent her life operating in the dark underbelly of society. She was physically imposing, tall, and exceptionally strong, with a rough, weathered face and a sharp, calculating mind. By the time she arrived in Richmond, Webster had accumulated a massive criminal record across 2 countries. She had been arrested multiple times for petty theft, shoplifting, and financial fraud, using aliases including Kate Webster, and Lawler. She had spent time behind bars, including hard labor at Wandsworth Prison. She also had an illegitimate young son named John, whom she struggled to support. For Webster, employment was not a career. It was a temporary shield to hide her criminal past and find her next target. When Webster applied for the position at Mayfield Cottages, she entirely fabricated her background, hiding her prison record and criminal reputation. Mrs. Thomas, desperate for help and perhaps blinded by Webster's initial eagerness to please, hired her on January 27, 1879. It was a catastrophic mismatch from the beginning. The domestic dynamic in a Victorian home relied on the submission of the servant to the mistress, but Kate Webster was not a woman who submitted to anyone. Within days, the thin veneer of respectability crumbled. Mrs. Thomas realized that her new maid was sloppy, resentful, and incompetent at basic domestic duties. Worse still, Webster had a severe drinking habit. She frequently vanished from the cottage in the evenings and spent hours drinking spirits at local public houses, including the Hole in the Wall. When she returned late at night, smelling of gin and slurring her words, Mrs. Thomas would fly into a rage. By the end of February, Mrs. Thomas decided she could no longer tolerate the disrespect, poor performance, and public drunkenness. She officially terminated Webster's employment and ordered her to leave on Friday, February 28th. But Webster was broke, with nowhere to go and a young child to feed. She begged for an extension. Mrs. Thomas, showing a brief moment of fatal compassion, agreed to let her stay over the weekend, extending the deadline to Monday, March 2nd. It was a compromise that would cost Mrs. Thomas her life and set off one of the most terrifying legal storms in British history. The crime. Sunday, March 2nd, 1879, was a cold, damp, and gloomy evening in Richmond. The weekend grace period was drawing to a close, and by the next morning Webster was expected to vanish from the property forever. Seeking a temporary escape from the suffocating tension inside her own home, Mrs. Thomas dressed in her finest Sunday clothes and walked down the road to attend the evening service at the local Presbyterian church on Vine Road. Neighbors later recalled seeing the wealthy widow in her usual pew, looking respectable but anxious. She left early, around 9 o'clock, worried about what her volatile maid might be doing alone in her house. Her instincts were tragically correct. When Mrs. Thomas unlocked her front door and stepped into the dim hallway of Mayfield Cottages, Kate Webster was waiting for her. Webster had spent the evening drinking, fueling a dark rage over her upcoming eviction. An argument broke out almost immediately. Mrs. Thomas, furious that her servant was intoxicated on the Sabbath, ordered her to leave the house immediately rather than waiting for morning. But Webster was done taking orders from the wealthy widow. Poverty, resentment, and humiliation boiled over into violence. The confrontation reached a boiling point at the top of the dark wooden staircase. Webster, significantly taller and stronger than her 55-year-old employer, lunged forward. With massive force, she threw Mrs. Thomas down the stairs. The elderly woman crashed against the wooden steps and landed in a semi-conscious heap at the bottom. The fall alone caused severe trauma, but Webster panicked. She knew that if Mrs. Thomas survived, the police would be called and she would be sent back to prison. To silence her employer permanently, Webster rushed down, pinned the helpless woman to the floor, and strangled her until Mrs. Thomas stopped moving. The cottage fell silent. Webster stood alone in the hallway with the body of her mistress. In Victorian England, murder carried a mandatory sentence of death by hanging. Webster knew the police would trace the crime back to her because she was the only other person living in the house. Her only chance was to make sure the body of Julia Martha Thomas was never found. Over the next several days, she transformed the orderly home into a site of methodical horror. Webster carried the body into the scullery, the small back room used for heavy domestic labor. Using a meat saw and a sharp carving knife from the kitchen drawers, she dismembered her mistress. But cutting up the body was only the first step. She needed to destroy the evidence. Her eyes turned to the copper laundry copper built into the corner of the scullery, a large basin used to boil stained linens over an open coal fire. She packed the basin with coal, lit a fire beneath it, filled it with water, and placed the severed remains of Mrs. Thomas inside. For several days and nights, Webster kept the fire blazing, boiling her mistress's body to separate the flesh from the bones and make identification nearly impossible. She threw other parts into the kitchen hearth, burning them into ash. The labor was immense, yet Webster worked tirelessly, driven by a desperate instinct for self-preservation. During the first week of March, thick, greasy smoke began to billow from the chimney of No. 2 Mayfield Cottages. A foul, sickeningly sweet odor drifted across the neighborhood. Neighbors noticed the strange smell, described as a mixture of burning animal fat and sulfur. Yet in 19th century London, where coal fires and pollution were everywhere, no one initially suspected a crime. People simply closed their windows, unaware that a woman was boiling her employer a few yards away. As the process ended, Webster packed the bones and a portion of the flesh into a large wooden box covered in dark leather and tightly corded it shut. The skull and one foot could not fit, so she disposed of them separately, burying the foot in a nearby allotment and hiding the head in a place that would baffle historians for more than a century. Then, in one of the most stomach-churning details of the case, she scooped the rendered fat into earthenware jars and tried to sell it as high-quality cooking dripping. The investigation. With Mrs. Thomas dead and her remains hidden, Kate Webster did not immediately run. Instead, she exploited a massive vulnerability in Victorian society, the lack of modern identification. In 1879, there were no photo IDs, fingerprints were not used by police, and background checks did not exist. If you wore a wealthy woman's clothes, held her keys, and stood inside her home, people could be made to assume you were that woman. Webster opened her late employer's wardrobes, dressed herself in Mrs. Thomas's silk gowns, put on her jewelry, and began living as the mistress of Mayfield Cottages. For nearly 2 weeks, she pulled off this audacious identity theft. Neighbors and tradesmen believed Mrs. Thomas was simply away, while Webster moved through the house as if it now belonged to her. But her goal was to liquidate Mrs. Thomas's life for cash. To do that, she needed to clear out the furniture and dispose of the heavy leather box sitting in the scullery. On March 4th, Webster hired a local boy named Robert Thomas, offering him a few pence to help her carry the box down to the River Thames. They walked to Richmond Bridge, but finding it too busy, carried it further down to the railway bridge at Barnes. When a boy was not looking, Webster hoisted the container over the railing and dropped it into the water. She heard the splash, assumed her secret was buried forever, and returned to the cottage. The next morning, the river betrayed her. On March 5, 1879, a coal porter named Henry Wheatley was working along the muddy riverbank at Barnes when the tide receded, exposing the waterlogged leather box tangled in the reeds. Wheatley cut the cords and forced the lid open. Expecting stolen goods or clothing, he found a human torso and severed limbs packed inside. There was no head and no feet, making identification impossible. The discovery triggered panic across London, and the press dubbed it the Barnes Mystery. While police struggled to identify the body, Webster tried to sell the cottage's furniture. She approached Henry Porter, an old acquaintance, introducing herself as a wealthy widow named Mrs. Thomas who had inherited a house and needed to sell everything quickly before moving to Ireland. Porter introduced her to John Church, the landlord of the Rising Sun public house. Church bought several pieces of furniture and took a pair of Mrs. Thomas's dresses for his wife. Webster was close to getting away with the perfect crime. The facade shattered because of Miss Ives, a suspicious neighbor who had known the real Mrs. Thomas for years. She noticed odd lights inside Mayfield Cottages and saw a delivery van carrying furniture away. When she investigated, she did not find the quiet Mrs. Thomas. She found Kate Webster wearing Mrs. Thomas's distinctive silk dress and ordering moving men around. Miss Ives alerted Mrs. Thomas's friends and the police. Webster panicked. She grabbed her son, snatched Mrs. Thomas's remaining gold pocket watch, fled the house, and boarded a steamship to Ireland. When detectives entered number 2 Mayfield Cottages, the scullery told the truth. Constables found bloodstains near the copper, charred bone fragments in the kitchen hearth, and greasy residue inside the cooking pots. A check with police at Barnes connected the remains in the river box to the evidence in Richmond. Scotland Yard detectives chased Webster across the sea and arrested her at her uncle's farm. But as she was dragged back to London, she realized she still had one final card to play: the confession. When the steamship carrying Kate Webster back from Ireland docked at Holyhead, she was met by police and a massive, jeering crowd. The British public was gripped by fascination and fury. Newspapers had already tried and convicted her in the court of public opinion. Yet inside her holding cell at Richmond Police Station, Webster remained composed. She knew the police were under pressure to wrap up the case, and she decided to use that pressure against them. On March 30th, 1879, Webster announced she was ready to make a full statement. But what followed was not a confession. It was a calculated web of perjury designed to send innocent men to the gallows. Webster claimed she had been a helpless bystander to a plot masterminded by John Church, the landlord of the Rising Sun, and Henry Porter, the local family friend. She said they had murdered Mrs. Thomas in a dispute over money and forced her at gunpoint to help chop up the body and dispose of the remains. To make the lie believable, Webster mixed it with real facts. John Church did possess Mrs. Thomas's dresses because Webster had sold them to him. Henry Porter had helped find buyers for property because Webster had presented herself as Mrs. Thomas and claimed she needed to sell the furniture quickly. She twisted ordinary transactions into evidence of murder. For 24 hours, the strategy worked. Scotland Yard arrested Church and Porter. They were thrown into cells and treated as suspects in a capital murder. If Webster's story held up, the two men could face the gallows alongside her, where she might try to save herself by testifying against them. But by naming specific accomplices, Webster had created a timeline that could be tested. Defense lawyers and skeptical detectives scrutinized every hour after March 2nd. The breakthrough came when investigators checked the evening the leather box was thrown into the Thames. Webster claimed John Church helped her carry the crate to Barnes Bridge, but the Rising Sun Ledger and regular patrons proved he had been behind the bar at that very time. Henry Porter was also shown to be away from the scene during the timeline Webster had constructed. Once the lie collapsed, Webster changed her story again. She cleared Church and Porter, but instantly replaced them with a new scapegoat. Her estranged husband, a man she called Webb, who had appeared from London, killed the widow, forced her to boil the remains, and vanished back into the fog. That second statement destroyed what little credibility she had left. The magistrates dismissed the charges against John Church and Henry Porter. The Crown prosecutors realized they could not rely on Webster's words. Her conflicting confessions were set aside. The phantom accomplices disappeared, and the case began to rest on the physical evidence left in the house, in the river, and in the property she had tried to sell. The legal mistake. As the trial approached, the case of Kate Webster became more than a murder prosecution. It became a test of whether Victorian justice could stay calm under public pressure. London newspapers printed sensational stories about her every day. She was called a monster and a human butcher, and the public demanded quick retribution. The danger was that the courts could begin acting less like a legal system and more like a crowd searching for punishment. Under English law, every defendant was entitled to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in court. That rule had to apply even to someone accused of a crime as horrifying as this one. Yet the investigation had already shown how quickly the system could be manipulated. John Church and Henry Porter had been arrested because of Webster's false statement, not because independent proof placed them at the murder scene. The missing head created another problem. Without the skull, the Crown had to prove that the remains found in the river were truly those of Julia Martha Thomas. The prosecution needed more than rumor, disgust, or public hatred. It needed a chain of evidence strong enough to survive in court. The remains from Barnes, the scullery at Mayfield Cottages, the burned bones, the missing property, and the witnesses who saw Webster acting as Mrs. Thomas. This was the legal danger at the heart of the case. If the state cut corners because the defendant was unpopular, the same shortcut could later be used against an innocent person. To convict Webster safely, the court had to slow down, strip away the sensational claims, and force the evidence to speak. The courtroom turning point. On July 2nd, 1879, the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey was packed to capacity. Wealthy spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the courtroom to catch a glimpse of the woman newspapers called the Richmond murderer. Kate Webster sat in the dock, dressed in a black bonnet and shawl, her face expressionless. Presiding over the trial was Mr. Justice Denman, a respected judge determined to bring order to a case already damaged by hysteria. The prosecution knew Webster's words could not be trusted. She had lied, accused innocent men, changed her story, and invented accomplices. So Sir Hardinge Gifford built the case around a timeline and physical proof. He brought forward tradesmen, delivery boys, neighbors, and railway witnesses. One by one, they traced Webster's movements from the night Mrs. Thomas returned from church to the morning Webster fled for Ireland. The turning point came with the expert medical evidence. Dr. Thomas Bond, a pioneering forensic pathologist who would later work on the Jack the Ripper case, examined the remains found in the waterlogged box from the Thames. He explained that the bones had been separated at the joints, not by a skilled surgeon, but by someone using raw force and ordinary household tools. The prosecution also connected the remains to the evidence inside Mayfield cottages. Bone fragments in the kitchen hearth, blood near the copper, and greasy residue left behind in the pots. The defense argued that the body could not be identified with absolute certainty because the head was missing. But the Crown tightened the chain. Robert Thomas identified the leather box he had helped Webster carry toward Barnes Bridge. Miss Ives testified that she saw Webster wearing Mrs. Thomas's distinctive silk dress and directing men as furniture was removed. The stolen clothes, furniture sales, remains in the river, and evidence in the scullery all pointed back to one person. After 6 days of testimony, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. Mr. Justice Denman placed a black cap upon his head and sentenced Kate Webster to hang by the neck until dead. It seemed the case was finally over. But as the guards moved to lead her down to the cells, Webster lunged forward, grabbed the iron railing of the dock, and threw the British legal system into panic. The twist: the moment the judge finished pronouncing the death sentence, Kate Webster took a deep breath, looked directly at the bench, and cried out that she was with child. She was weaponizing a centuries-old legal doctrine known as the plea of pregnancy. Under English common law, the state had the right to execute a convicted murderer, but did not have the right to destroy an innocent unborn child. If a condemned woman could prove she was quick with child, her execution had to be stayed until after birth. Webster knew that in 1879, a stay of execution could sometimes become a permanent commutation to life in prison. The announcement threw the Old Bailey into immediate deadlock. Modern pregnancy tests, ultrasound technology, and forensic biology did not exist. Yet Mr. Justice Denman could not ignore the plea. To do so would risk an unlawful double execution and scandalize the Victorian government. To resolve the crisis, the judge resurrected an archaic medieval ritual that had not been used in decades. He ordered the immediate empanelment of a jury of matrons. The court bailiffs moved into the spectator gallery and selected 12 married women who happened to be present in the courthouse. The women were brought down to the well of the court and sworn under oath. They were ordered to take Webster into a private room beneath the courtroom, examine her body, and return with a verdict on whether she was telling the truth. For a tense hour, the courtroom waited. Down in the gaslit rooms below, 12 ordinary Victorian women performed a crude physical assessment, feeling Webster's abdomen for signs of fetal movement. It was a surreal clash of eras, a modern capital murder trial built on forensic pathology and timeline evidence, suddenly paralyzed by a ritual from the medieval past. When the door opened, the matrons returned. Their forewoman stood and delivered a clear verdict. Kate Webster was not pregnant. Her final attempt to exploit the system had failed. The judge affirmed the execution order, and the guards dragged Webster down to the condemned cell at Wandsworth Prison. The loophole she had tried to use was closed by the very citizens she had hoped to fool. The bigger meaning: the conviction and execution of Kate Webster on July 29, 1879, did more than bring a brutal criminal to justice. It exposed a legal system caught between the medieval past and modern forensic science. The same court that heard careful medical evidence from Dr. Bond was also forced to summon a jury of matrons from the spectator gallery. That contradiction showed how Victorian law was changing, but not quickly enough. The case also showed why due process matters most when the public is furious. The police had nearly destroyed 2 innocent men because Webster gave them a story that sounded useful. John Church and Henry Porter were saved only because their timeline was tested and their alibis were verified. That part of the case is easy to overlook beside the horror of the murder, but it is the point that makes the story larger than one crime. A justice system that relies on panic can become as dangerous as the criminal it is chasing. In the end, Webster was convicted not because the newspapers hated her and not because the crowd wanted blood. She was convicted because the evidence formed an unbreakable chain. The missing widow, the remains in the river, the burned bones in the hearth, the blood in the scullery, the stolen clothes, the furniture sales, and the witnesses who saw her movements. The law had to remain slow and methodical, because speed without proof had already almost sent innocent men to their deaths. The story of Julia Martha Thomas carried one final chilling twist. For 131 years, historians and criminologists wondered what Webster had done with the missing skull. It was never recovered during the 1879 police search, and the absence of the head remained one of the darkest loose ends in the Barnes mystery. That mystery was solved in October of 2010 during a routine garden excavation in Richmond. Workers digging in the backyard of television presenter and naturalist Sir David Attenborough uncovered a human skull buried deep in the soil. The skull showed signs of fractures consistent with a fall down a wooden staircase and marks of having been boiled in a copper basin. Sir David's home had been built on the site of the old hole in the wall public house, the same tavern where Kate Webster had spent her evenings drinking before returning to Mayfield Cottages. Modern forensic testing finally closed the evidence locker on the Barnes mystery after more than a century in the dark. The skull of Julia Martha Thomas, buried in the dark dirt for over a century, stands as a silent reminder of a terrifying truth. Kate Webster did everything in her power to break the rules of society, of morality, and of the legal system itself. She lied, she butchered, and she tried to send innocent men to the gallows to save her own neck. But in the end, it wasn't vengeance or public anger that defeated her. It was the slow, methodical, and unyielding machine of due process. The law had to remain calm, follow the evidence, and protect the system from manipulation, because the moment the justice system abandons its rules to catch a monster, it becomes the most dangerous monster of all. What do you think about the verdict? Did the court handle the false accusations against Church and Porter correctly, or did the system move too fast under public pressure? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden legal mysteries of history.